So we're doing everything possible to discourage any UNAMIR, any effort to have UNAMIR. Certainly we wanted to discourage.
To have a foreign intervention that time, yeah.
Yeah, because we knew any foreign intervention would have been to our disadvantage. Because at that point in time, the prize was to capture state power. Yes,
So
it was to capture state power.
I can imagine when a lion is just almost catching the prey. If you try to stop it,
Yes,
it's difficult. Yes.
yeah, but that's where I think Kagame's logic started being different from the logic for a number of us. But of course, way back in 1994, during that period after shooting down of the plane, the genocide has gathered momentum. The killing of the Hutus and Tutsis has gathered momentum. By the time we came to June, really, if you asked me, even in retrospect, and I think I've told you this before, would you do the same confronted with the provisional government and Interahamwe and all these killers of that time? I would absolutely do the same.
Yes.
Yes, I would have done the same. Because although it was not the primary motivation to save Tutsis, but at least us capturing state power has saved many Tutsis as a byproduct.
Yeah.
As a byproduct. And I think it saved also many Hutus.
No, and
including you, Sixbert, and many
me,
others.
Definitely.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
so,
including me, yes, yeah. Dear listeners, hello and welcome to this program, the English service of Radio Television ISHAKWE, the voice of ISHAKWE Rwanda Freedom Movement. Yeah, we are broadcasting from Washington, D.C., United States of America, every Monday at 3 p.m. Today's guest is Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sixbert. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed for coming to this program. And today we are going to talk about how President Bill Clinton led the world to abandon Rwanda in 1994. Rwandans were left on their own after the genocide against the Tutsis started in April 6, 1994. That time, the United Nations had a mission, a permanent mission in Rwanda called UNAMIR, United Nations Mission for Rwanda, and the mission was ordered to withdraw. It was a mission of 2,500 men, and it received the order to withdraw about 2,250 or 2,300. A symbolic presence was left of about 270 people, including soldiers and civilians. Rwandans were left on their own. They were slaughtered for 100 days until the RPF seized the state power in July 1994. Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, I know you have been very active in the diplomacy during the rebellion. You were Secretary General of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF. And that time, during those months, you had full speed, actually, until you seized the state power. You have followed contacts with international stakeholders, main powers, especially the United States of America. What do you think about the role of the United States that time, and especially the role of the President Bill Clinton that time? Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very important matter. And it's a subject that, of course, is very complex and very deep. because that's the period, the 100 days during which the genocide against Tutsi was executed. But it's during also the same period of time that many Hutus, especially Hutu politicians, were perceived by the government of the day to be in the opposition, plus many other Hutus who died at the hands of RPF's army, the Rwandese Patriotic Army. So it was a very probably I would say that it is one of the most significant periods in the entire history of Rwanda, because it also led to the transition of power from the Habyarimana regime, the provisional government that assumed the power very briefly after President Habyarimana was assassinated by RPF alongside the president of Burundi. And so that is, if there was something to be said about Rwanda at the end of the 20th century, certainly those 100 days are very, very crucial to look at what happened during that period of time. But let me also preface my comments by trying to share with the people who follow these programs in English, who are listeners and people who view this program, that the events of from April 6, 1994 to July 19th, when RPF took over power in Rwanda, was preceded by another period from the signing of the Arusha Peace Agreement in August 1993. In fact, Sixbert, you remember, we used to meet there. And that was also, after that, that was the when I was made the Secretary General of the RPF. And amongst the provisions of the Arusha Peace Agreement was that a government of national unity would be established between the government and the political parties that were in opposition and the RPF within 37 days. You remember that, 37 days. That was quite ambitious, and it was never to be, of course. Number two, the other provision was that the United Nations would be able to help now create a peacekeeping force that, among other things, would help us implement the setting up of the transitional institutions, the process of setting up the national army, the army of the RPF and the government army, force army Rwandese at that time, and that was Rwandese Patriotic Army, and all the other things that were provided for in the Arusha Peace Agreement. So that was the second most important thing that was to happen. But as you know, and the third, which was very important, which would also be instrumental in creating the government of national unity, was RPF sending 600 of its troops to the parliament of Rwanda at that time, called the Sende, alongside other people who were going to participate in the transitional government, because remember, there was power sharing. And so RPF was supposed to have some contribution to the ministers and directed the cabinet, people who would participate in that transitional institutions, including the parliament. But what followed after signing the peace agreement, the first great failure that led to what happened after April 6th was that because of the bureaucracy of the United Nations, and also because Rwanda was not really a priority on the minds of the big powers, especially those who have veto powers at the United Nations, United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. Rwanda was not really their priority. So although a Security Council resolution had been taken to indeed create this force, nothing happened. Nothing happened. I remember very vividly that myself and Patrick Mazimhaka, my colleague, and James Rwego were part of a joint government RPF delegation, the first of its kind. It was a confidence building measure. We went to the United Nations and met Boutros Ghali, the then Secretary General, trying to say that, they need to help us, in the process of expediting the creation of this force so that we could help in the setting up of the institutions. So there was a lot of dragging of feet on the part of the United Nations, thanks to the big powers that considered Rwanda not to be their priority at that time. But the other thing that happened during that time was that President Habyarimana, who was the president of Rwanda at that time, along other people who advised him and his government, were also dragging feet. They created obstacle after every obstacle in order to delay the setting up of the transitional government. In the meantime, of course, they always had plan B in retrospect, as we came to learn, while at the same time also RPF thought that at some point that the peace agreement was not going to work. So they too, RPF, and I mean the military, Kagame and the high command, were also contemplating about plan B. That's how the military mind thinks, that if this does not work, we are going to revert to plan B. So both Habyarimana's group and President, not president at that time, was Kagame, as the chairman of the high command and vice chairman of RPF, was also thinking about plan B. That's why RPF was infiltrating more and more people into the Sende and across the country, while at the same time also most of the preparation that took place that eventually created the momentum for genocide against the Tutsis and the killings of the Hutus that took place at that time on Habyarimana's side, they took place during this period of time. So I wanted to give that background to understand that while April 6, the shooting down of the plane provided a powerful trigger for Habyarimana's side, the people, the Hutu extremists on his side, to start killing Hutus and Tutsis. It is also true that it created the momentum for RPF now to be in the logic of war, of saying, because both sides had literally destroyed the Arusha Peace Agreement. With the shooting down of the plane, the Arusha Peace Agreement was dead because we had broken the ceasefire, and the other side started killing the same night on April 6, killing Hutu opposition people and killing the Tutsis. And so essentially, both RPF and the government side went into competition in the logic of war. It was now from then onwards, it was a scramble as to who wins the war and establishes the victor's conditions. And what followed, of course, is a matter of history looking back. Both the Tutsis perished in that genocide. Many Hutus were killed, both by the Hutu extremists, but also by the RPF. I wanted to give that preamble but maybe you may ask me more questions.
Yeah, of course, when with the downing of the presidential plane that killed President Habyarimana and his entourage, and the president of Burundi as well, and some cabinet ministers. In Rwanda, the pro-Habyarimana elite felt that it was the end of the regime. It was the end of the regime, and they didn't see a way out. They didn't see how they could keep control. They could keep power in their hands. The first reaction was just to slaughter all the opposition leaders immediately after the information that President Habyarimana was dead. Immediately they said, we have to eliminate any possible competition. That's what they did immediately. The world was informed immediately about what happened in Kigali, that all those opposition leaders were killed in the night of the 6th of April and the day of the 7th, when the then Prime Minister was killed as well by the presidential guard and some other members of the transitional cabinet. So actually that time, there was no call from the international community, no call from big powers, no call from the United States to stop the killings or to have a serious force of intervention or to change the mission of the UNAMIR, the United Nations mission for Rwanda. There was no call to have it changed in a way they could stop the killings that have started in the capital. After the opposition leaders, they started killing Tutsis. So that time, the whole world was just watching like on TV. Actually, it was on TV. In front of their TVs. They were watching what was going on in Rwanda, how Rwandans were slaughtering other Rwandans because of ethnic background. There was no reaction at all. But I know you have been in touch with the US administration that time, some members of that administration, and you know the efforts they did. I mean the efforts by the President Bill Clinton to stop any intervention from other countries. So the international community, the West didn't do anything, even Africa didn't do anything about that. But still, within the UN Security Council, the US administration was busy asking or convincing all members that the intervention wasn't needed, that they should let the Rwandans sort out their problems between themselves when people were being slaughtered in the whole country. So
precisely.
yeah, so I wanted to ask you actually to talk about the fact. I know you've been in touch with different people, different diplomats, and you have plenty of information about that. And would you like to share the information with us, Dr. Theogene?
Yes. You know, Sixbert in 1998. Let me fast forward a bit to 1998 when I was Rwanda's ambassador to the United States. I had the privilege of being present when both Madeleine Albright, who was President Clinton's permanent representative to the United Nations during the genocide in 1994. And I also had the privilege and honor to be present when President Clinton visited Rwanda in 1998. I remember at the airport where the event took place. At that time, the Americans considered Rwanda to be an unsafe place, and even the president of the United States could not venture beyond the airport Kanombe Kigali International Airport. And in his remarks, which you might recall, President Clinton is a very unique and consummate politician who might even cry and show a lot of empathy in his speeches. And he said that him and many others didn't know how Rwandans were being butchered day by day in that period of 100 days. But of course, that's being very dishonest because President Clinton, like any American president in any period, presides over the world order as the most important, the most influential, the most important leader in the whole world. And President Clinton, like any other president, had all the instruments of political, military, and economic power to know what was going on in Rwanda. In fact, often they know much more than we, citizens of the world, might know of particular societies or particular countries. He had the CIA, he had the military to know, number one, exactly the circumstances of the shooting down of the plane. He was very much aware of what was going on after the signing of the peace agreement, because remember, the United States, Belgium, France, the United Nations, Tanzania, Congo, which was then called Zaire, Uganda, Burundi, remind me if I forget, those were observers. Those were the observers to the Russia peace agreement. They are the ones who are supposed to help us in the process of implementing the Russia peace process. So he knew what happened between the signing of the peace agreement and April 6th, and what happened on April 6th, and of course what happened thereafter. That's number one. Number two, because of the geopolitics of the world at that time, remember it is soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the fiasco, the American peacekeeping operation in Somalia that went crazy and very tragic with the Black Hawk Down. I'm sure many listeners or viewers have seen
Yes,
the movie. Bosnia. And at that time, President Clinton led the effort in fact, in issuing something called the presidential directive. I've forgotten exactly which number. It's either 156 or 56. We shall figure out what it was. But essentially it was saying, if you read between the words, it was like saying where America does not have really vital interests, let's be careful about peacekeeping unless we know what exactly our exit strategy was. So they had no, after Somalia debacle, President Clinton led the effort at the United Nations, essentially to say, once the killings started, that the entire peacekeeping force should be abandoned, essentially leaving, of course, from what you said, leaving a skeleton of 270 men and civilians, essentially to be spectators in the slaughter that followed for the next 100 days. And remember, also, because of the dubious role of the French or France, having been the ardent supporters of the regime of Habyarimana, and having supported the regime from the very beginning when RPF invaded Rwanda in 1990, alongside, of course, Zaire, Mobutu's army, and briefly the Belgians. But the French remained steadfast in supporting the Habyarimana regime. But as normally happens, this is a key lesson that Rwandans need to learn, that where and essentially, it's also what you see, happening in Gaza in our time. We used to say that we shall never witness a tragedy unfold before our eyes, because the word was claimed that never again. You thought that after Rwanda there wouldn't be another genocide, but of course we've seen Darfur, we've seen the Rohingya, we've seen all these wars and the destruction of civilians, the deaths of civilians. But essentially, the United States bargained with France to say, let's simply abandon Rwanda. And Rwanda, of course, France was not about to be concerned about Rwanda, except if it wanted to support the government of the day, but the government of the day was in shambles. They had created a so-called provisional government. And what the provisional government started doing was quite embarrassing, I'm sure, for some people in France. And so, because United States was giving something to France elsewhere, France was also willing to keep a blind eye or to close its ears to the suffering of Rwandans, not only Tutsis. You remember we used to joke that the French are pro-Hutu, the Belgians are pro-Hutu, and that nobody amongst all these whites are pro-Tutsi, until much later, of course, when now these days everyone says that the Americans and the British are pro-Tutsi. But for me, the British, the French, the Americans, or anybody else is neither pre-Tutsi or pro-Hutu, because as you can see, even when now Clinton has become the champion of the RPF regime under Kagame, he was the very one who led the charge to abandon Tutsis to their killers in 1994. He's the very one who abandoned Tutsis in the first instance, and the Hutus who died during that period of time. And it's a double tragedy, because the very people who abandoned Tutsi in 1994 are the very people subsequently, as Kagame went on rampage, killing Hutus in Rwanda and killing Hutus in Congo, in what many other people, and that's another subject which I have time to discuss it, when what the UN and others call war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even acts of genocide by Kagame's military. The very people now, both the Americans, the British, now the French, who used to be Kagame's enemies, are now working together to prop up the regime. So if you have abandoned the Tutsis and you've abandoned the Hutus, who in Rwanda do you like and who do you support? So that's a very flimsy kind of, and there are any Rwandans who think that these big powers are pro this ethnic group or the other group, that's an illusion. They are only pro themselves and pro
Yes,
their interests.
yes,
Yes,
definitely.
yes,
They're after their interest, nothing else.
yes.
Yeah, lives of Africans, they really don't matter to them at all.
Let me give also two anecdotes that further explain that point. So in those after the April 6, in the subsequent weeks that followed, I also represented RPF in meetings that were convened by the president of Uganda, President Yoweri Museveni. And in those meetings, I remember it was a very and extremely busy week for me and everybody else. But I used to come from Mulindi and travel to Kampala. And the following day, President Museveni would convene a meeting between me and most of the Western ambassadors in Kampala, including the American ambassador, the French ambassador, the ambassador of Tanzania, and others. During that,
were Russians associated to or not? Russian
no, they were
or
not.
Chinese?
No,
Only the West.
Only the Western ambassadors and Tanzania as facilitator.
Yes.
Some of those meetings actually were attended by Ambassador Kanyero Shoki, who was Rwanda's ambassador to
Uganda.
To Uganda at that time. But what always amazed me, when I always had only two talking points from the RPF. I always, everyone was insisting that there should be a ceasefire. And would be saying, but this so-called provisional government is killing Tutsis. Wherever our soldiers reach, they find mass graves of freshly killed Tutsis. And of course, as you know, they have been killing Hutus as well, especially those that were perceived to be in the opposition. Of course, I didn't even have that information at that time, that even some of the people that were freshly killed or the mass graves at that time turned out to be people who were also killed by RPF in its path during its offensive, its final offensive. But I would always say, but you are telling us to have a ceasefire agreement with this provisional government, but this government is killing Tutsis, is killing Hutus. How can we have a ceasefire agreement with them? Why don't you ask them actually to stop the killing if they want a ceasefire? And I could see they were always irritated. I was young then and vibrant and full of energy. And I knew that I was speaking for a force that was military and also politically had an upper, we had an upper hand in terms of, we had moral high ground. Because if a government is killing its citizens instead of defending them, we are the rebels. We always say, for us, our purpose is to stop the killings and establish law and order in Rwanda. Those were the two talking points. If you go back and listen to what I was saying, or Claude Dusaidi was saying, or Jared Gahima, people we sent to New York at that time, were saying, or Patrick Mazimhaka, or Jacques Bihozagara, my colleague, both Patrick Mazimhaka and Bihozagara, unfortunately, are dead. That was the talking point. We want to stop the killings and we want to establish law and order. And I could see towards the end of the week, because I went there for 5 days. At one point, President Museveni was being irritated, I think. I think I was kind of, I'm sure the ambassadors were behind the scenes telling maybe President Museveni that I was being intransigent. But that was the message I had. You can kill the messenger, but that's exactly, and I believed it too. I believed it as well. And at the end of it all, when we saw that there was, and they started putting a lot of pressure on President Museveni, all these Western powers led by Americans, all this information has come to the public. It's no longer secret. It was declassified. Now we can read and see what was going on behind the scene. They were putting pressure on Museveni because they knew that we were being supported by Museveni. So they were putting pressure on him to put pressure on us to make a deal with the provisional government. So rather than
to put pressure on you in order to have a ceasefire.
Yes.
And the transitional government, that I mean a transitional government including RPF and then transitional government, right?
With the provisional government of the day.
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Mm.
they're trying to put pressure on us. So I went back to Murindi and I briefed Kagame, I briefed Kanyarengo on what was going on. So our strategy then, if you remember, we declared a unilateral ceasefire. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes, I do remember. Yeah.
So rather than make a deal,
Actually, that was done, I think, after your meeting with President Museveni, immediately after that, right?
yes,
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 in
and but
Kampala. Mm.
we didn't declare it. But I went back and met Museveni. I remember I was with my friend Kare Kaihura. We went and I briefed President Museveni that we had decided to have a unilateral ceasefire. And immediately in his office, he called in President Mwinyi and told him that RPF had agreed to have a unilateral ceasefire. I had stepped out of the office after what happened. Then he called me back. President Museveni called me back and say you can declare it. I think naturally he wanted to take some kind of, because the pressure had been so much on him, he also wanted to take credit that he had actually delivered, that RPF had now accepted to have a unilateral ceasefire. And then after that, I traveled to Arusha, Tanzania, where most of the senior leaders of Chama Pinduzi in Tanzania and the leadership, the Prime Minister and others were present, and also the Secretary General of the OAU, Salim Ahmed Salim. I later learned that day that actually there was a provisional government representatives were also camping there in Arusha in the hope that Tanzania as a facilitator would organize a meeting between me and them. They didn't even know that it was only me who was representing RPF. They probably thought there was a big delegation, but it was only me. They thought that we were going to have a meeting. When I learned about that overnight, early in the morning, I escaped from Arusha. I escaped and I went by road, and I went and
You
by the
went to Kenya.
Kenyan border
Mm.
to Arusha, because I had told the Tanzanian leaders that there was no way that we were going to negotiate with the provisional government. Then why do I say that? You can see that the preoccupation of the United States at that time and all these other powers, France and others, and the facilitator, were not even asking the very important questions like, actually, who shot down the plane? And number two, the genocide against Tutsi was well underway. That was in April. And most of a lot of politicians in the Hutu politicians in the opposition had been killed. Nobody was asking about that, but they were more interested in us having to make a deal with the provisional government, which to be honest, I was quite angry those days. I was quite an angry young man those days, and I'm sure many other people in the RPF were equally angry, and rightly so, because the international community had abandoned. They had taken their dogs, they had taken their whatever. Even those Rwandans, as you know, Sixbert, who had worked in embassies or
Yeah,
worked for
they
them
were
as,
left behind to die. I know. I know.
they were just left behind to die.
Yes.
They just left on their own. So that is one anecdote I wanted to share with the listeners and viewers to show how outsiders behave whenever we become irresponsible amongst ourselves and start killing each other, thinking that somebody will come to your rescue. Nobody will ever come to your rescue. The best thing is not to kill your fellow Rwandans, thinking that if there's nobody who owes you a living. I think that's one of the things that, although it's manipulated by Kagame these days to say that, but he's being very dishonest when he says it. I will give you another anecdote. So later on, I think it must have been in May. Once again, I had the honor and privilege of going with then chairman of RPF, Alex Kanyarengwe, to Arusha, Tanzania. That was the period when also there was talk of having UNAMIR 2. There was a lot of pressure once again, a lot of pressure for ceasefire and a lot of pressure to see how to revive something that was already dead, because RPF and the government of the day had literally destroyed the Arusha Peace Agreement. And both of them were engaged in a power struggle to see who captures power in Kigali. And for RPF, although that was not the primary reason why RPF was fighting, that it is fighting to stop the genocide, that emerged that we are fighting to stop the genocide. Yes, genocide stopped because we captured power, but that was not the primary motivation.
It can't be the primary because the genocide
Yes.
started in April 1994, and
Yeah.
you've already
Yes.
been fighting for 4 years almost.
Yes, that was not the primary. That was not the primary reason. But in May, I went with Kanyarengwa once again in Arusha, and at that time there was everybody. There was everybody amongst the Western powers and many other ambassadors. I forget. So we're under pressure once again for ceasefire and for talking to the provisional government, and we are resistant. The leaders of Tanzania had met, as facilitator, had met Kanyarengwa and myself separately. And so we went to retire. In the evening, we went to retire, went to sleep. Chairman went to sleep, I went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was woken up by one of the young officers who normally traveled with Kanyarengwa and said, you know, they are saying that there's a provisional government delegation and they want you to sign a separate, some kind of separate agreement, ceasefire and how to resuscitate the Arusha Peace Agreement. So in the middle of the night, they had convened the meeting of all these ambassadors. I didn't wake up Chairman Kanyarengwe. I went with my colleague Simon Intare, another senior leader of who was an advisor to Chairman Kanyarengwe. So I went. I was shocked. The room was full of all these excellencies, the ambassadors, and they were all very angry.
Was it in the middle of the night or the next morning?
No, in the middle of the night, past
Yes.
midnight. It was past midnight. I had gone
Yes.
to bed. So I went, and of course, normally diplomats want to defer to the American ambassador because he speaks with authority. America carries a big stick, and sometimes it carries a big check too, but we were not beneficiaries of the big check by that time. That came later. And so it was the American ambassador who took the floor, essentially to castigate RPF. He said that the international community is very much disappointed with us, that all these things that are happening, that we are going to be accountable. And I was visibly annoyed, and I took the floor in response to him. I said, in fact, history is going to judge all of you harshly. I love the ability to have the moral high ground, because it allows you to say what is on your mind. And I told him, Your Excellency, I think not far from today, all of you will be held accountable for what you have not done and what you've done, not RPF. That's what I told him. And the meeting came to a conclusion, and the following day, I listened to, we had a meeting, and Prime Minister of Tanzania at that time, Prime Minister Marechera, also castigated us. He gave me a long lecture, said, you people, he was referring to us as Tutsis. And he was saying that, like Museveni, we negotiated, but for us, we are bent on capturing state power. In fact, it was prophetic because that was also true. But he was very angry with me, and I absorbed all that kind of stuff. I've shared all that to show two things. One is that not only President Clinton, as the leader of the United States, led a charge to influence the world to abandon Rwanda, thereby abandon the Tutsis to their killers, abandon Hutu, on the one hand being killed by the Hutu extremists, and on the other hand, of course, as we know by now, being killed by the RPF. So it was like saying, Rwandans, it's up to you, do whatever you want. It was like really a free pass for the RPF to do whatever it wants, and a free pass to the provisional government and the extremists and Interahamwe to do whatever they wanted to do. And in that, I would say that literally the whole world, including Africa, because remember, if we're in this region called East Africa, there was, yes, Museveni had supported RPF, yes, but there was also all these other countries in East Africa or in Africa.
Yeah,
The
especially
Organization of African
Tanzania
Unity.
has hosted the peace talks.
The peace
And
talks, yes.
the then
Yes.
Rwandan president was shot down when he was flying back from Dar es Salaam, from Tanzania.
And the one of
So,
Burundi, as
yeah,
well.
yeah, people,
Yes.
some Rwandans, we expected Tanzania to have a very strong stand at that time in order to bring back things to Arusha. But I didn't see that happening that time.
Yes. So Rwandans were left on their own, but I wanted to emphasize how it's really President Clinton who led the charge and influenced the world to abandon Tutsis, to abandon Hutu. And the case of Rwanda is a double tragedy, because right now, the same conditions that created the genocide exist in Rwanda today. But France and Britain and America, of course, are the principal backers of, notably UK and United States are the principal backers of the RPF regime from that time, from 1994 to this time. So it's a double tragedy, emphasizing amongst Rwandans that do not count on big powers to help you, because big powers help themselves.
Yeah,
They look
actually,
after their
that was
interests.
a very strong message to all
Yes.
Africans that whenever the situation worsens, you are on your own. You are on
Yes.
your own. Don't count on us. They come after the rain has stopped. Actually, I know that delegations from RPF approached Madeleine Albright, who was the permanent representative of the US in the United Nations. I guess they approached some people from the Department of State as well, and even the White House. Do you recall some names of people who have been approached, and what was their stand at that time?
No, at that time, IPF sent Jared Gahima, my brother, and the late Claude Saidi, who resided in Canada at that time, and who had been working with on the diplomatic front alongside Charles Murigande, who was a professor at Howard University here in Washington, D.C. And from 1991, I had been coming to the United States literally every year, and most frequently, sometimes alone or sometimes alongside Kagame in the meetings we would have at State Department, and also meeting people in the NGO community. But at that time, we had sent Jared Gahima and Claude Saidi to the US, essentially with the same message. But remember, and I know there are some people in the Rwandese community who have harped on it a lot, saying that there's a letter that Gahima and Saidi co-signed during that period of time after consultations with Madeleine Albright at State Department and many other people they met. During that period of time, it was very clear we had come to the conclusion that nobody, absolutely nobody, once President Clinton took that decision and UNAMI was disbanded, except for those symbolic 270 people that were left behind. And France, for its own reason, was willing to make a compromise with America for other interests they have elsewhere. There was not a single African, not a single member of the Security Council, permanent member, China, Russia, Britain, in addition to the US or France, or any other power on this planet. Essentially, Rwanda was abandoned. And once that was very, very clear, that gave a signal to us. It gave a signal to the RPF that now it's the logic of war. And within the logic of war, because many of us, if not all of us, most of us in the RPF were Tutsis, it was a clear signal to us that we are on our own. We are on our own. But the primary thrust of our strategy at that time, of course, was to defeat the provisional government. And it was the same logic on the other side of what remained of the government, the rump government, so-called provisional government. They had descended into being a bunch of killers and with Interahamwe all over the place, killing people. You know the pathetic situation that existed in Rwanda today. And I'm yet to hear any Rwandan, Hutu and Tutsi, other than probably the members of the inner circle of whatever remained of the regime of that time, who would have wished the Interahamwe to win the war in 1994? Who? I'm asking you, Sixbert, also to contribute to this. Who would have loved Interahamwe and the provisional government to win the war in 1994?
No, actually,
certainly
nobody. Actually, nobody in Rwanda. I wonder even the people who have been the elite that was pro-Habyarimana elite. I wonder if they could have wished the Interahamwe to win that time. Of course, when after the assassination of President Habyarimana, the ethnic hatred reached its peak. And that time, the thing was, on the side of many Hutus, any Hutu was good for them. Any Hutu was good for them. And that time, many Hutus, they wanted, they understood that they were going to lose the power, and it was the end of the Habyarimana regime. And then they didn't see their future because the propaganda from the beginning, when RPF invaded. The propaganda was that the evils are coming back. That's the reason why wherever RPF was, the civilians, they were running away. So when RPF was now approaching Kigali and actually showing signs that it was going to capture the state power, then people started running away from even out of Rwanda, going out of Rwanda. So that time, the people who have been there, there are many civilians who have never been involved in any politics. They understood there is no future for us if the Hutu regime loses power. So some they could have wished to have the devil they know than the devil they didn't know. That logic
Except
was there
that,
behind too. But when we talk
yes,
about the elite, if we talk about the elite, I don't think that people wanted Interahamwe to win. Not at all. I don't think so.
but why I said there are two things we have to make a distinction, and I have to make it very, very clear here. One is that Kagame's decision to assassinate President Habyarimana, and of course killing the president of Burundi as well, a Hutu, added fuel to an already explosive situation. Because if you look at what was happening between the signing of the peace agreement and April 6, when the plane was shot down by RPF soldiers, that was a very, very explosive kind of situation. It's like lighting a fire because it was the spark that ignited.
Yeah. Actually, it was the worst escalation. It was
Yes,
yeah. It was
yes. And so, while it for people who say it was the cause, it wasn't the cause, but it was a powerful trigger
yeah,
that
definitely.
when you already have an explosive situation and you provide something like that, it's you're providing fire and ammunition to an already explosive situation. But there is no justification for those who committed genocide against Tutsi and for those amongst the Hutu extremists who killed Hutu to say it's because our president was assassinated and so we have to descend on the population and start killing. I mean, presidents have
Yeah.
been assassinated across. I'm not justifying it, but what I'm saying is that there was no justification on the part of Hutu extremists to descend on the defenseless Tutsi population and Hutu population and to start killing them. Number two,
Actually, that was terrible that even the transitional government leaders actually called the population to for massacres, large-scale massacres against the
yes,
Tutsis throughout the country. That was terrible that they decided like that. And actually, that's when they lost even their cause in the war.
yeah. And at the same time, the other side of the coin, you've heard, and we shall have time to talk about that, the killings of Hutus, both by the extremists, but also by RPF during that period of time before and after in Congo. We shall have time to discuss that as well. But the same logic that because the provisional government and the Interahamwe and all these people, the population that was mobilized to kill Tutsis and Hutus, that because that happened, then RPF can justify itself that that's why it descended on the defenseless Hutu population and start killing. Simply because two evils cannot make a right. If the provisional government and the extremists have decided to kill Tutsis, why do you descend on the Hutu to start killing them? And two, why would you, knowing the explosive situation that existed during that period of time, why should Kagame have thought that's a very good idea to shoot down the plane, knowing the consequences, because
No,
he's the
I
one.
thought, I think that that time he miscalculated and thought that there will be confusion, and through that confusion, he will capture the state power.
No,
And
he
that
didn't.
time,
In fact, Kagame, to
he thought
correct you,
that massacres weren't going to reach the whole country, because at that time, many people thought that there was no way massacres were going to reach the whole country.
no, I would, I beg to differ a bit. Of course, he didn't know, because history does not allow us. You know, you make a decision, you never understand the full consequences in the future. It's true. And probably Kagame and the people in the high command who made the decision that they should. And by the way, it's not only that, was the fact that they succeeded on April 6th doesn't mean that they hadn't tried before. You've heard from other people, from other sources, including, I've mentioned it on radio, that I've heard from no other than General Kayumba Nyamwasa, who was the one in charge of DMI intelligence in the RPF, that they had actual provisions of assassinating Habyarimana in Kinihira, on the road to his home in Kanombe, the same day during this swearing-in ceremony, which of course would have been a disaster, including for the politicians and the 600 troops plus who were at the same day, which leads me, I wouldn't, I was not in Kagame's mind. I'm not in Kagame's mind. But all I can say is that unlike many of us who are working on the external front, we could not read exactly what was on Kagame's mind. Because at that point in time, once you make a decision to assassinate the president, who was the co-signer for the Arusha Peace Agreement, and you've destroyed the framework for peace, and the other side has prepared and is a co-signer to destroying the same Arusha Peace Agreement, both were in the logic of war. And at that time, Kagame was not preoccupied with saving Tutsi lives. So there was no way Kagame was thinking about saving Tutsi lives. Many of us would have wished that probably we should, RPF should be in the business of saving as many Tutsi lives as possible, where Tutsis in exile. Our organization was really a going back home kind of political organization. Then we built up all these other ideals of politics, of democratization, and so on and so forth. But where Tutsis, having in mind also the plight of other Tutsis, but Kagame and a few other people were not really, at that point, after the assassination of Habyarimana, were not in the business of saying, oh, let's do something to save some Tutsis. No, it was the logic of war. And that's why, even when Dusaidi and you had asked me that question, and Gahima were there, we used to say something that in retrospect I found so wrong and so callous. We used to say, all the Tutsis, by May, when the international community was pressing that there should be UNAMIR 2, we're saying, but all the Tutsis who are supposed to die have died anyway. What are you coming to save? And we use the same argument, and we shall have to talk about France, the role of France in all this in another program, because I did represent RPF to go and meet the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alain Juppé. I think that must have been June 1994. I was using the same argument that anyway, that all the Tutsis who are supposed to have died have died. What is Operation Turquoise? What are the French, who you know are not our friends? What are you coming to do in Rwanda? So we're doing everything possible to discourage any UNAMIR, any effort to have UNAMIR.
Yeah,
Certainly we wanted to discourage.
Have a foreign intervention that time, yeah.
Yeah, because we knew any foreign intervention would have been to our disadvantage. Because
Yes.
at that point in time, the prize was to capture state power. Yes,
No,
it was to capture state power.
I can imagine when a lion is just almost catching the prey. If you try to stop it,
Yes.
it's difficult. Yes.
Yeah, but that's where I think Kagame's logic started being different from the logic for a number of us. But of course, the way back in 1994, during that period after shooting down of the plane, the genocide has gathered momentum. The killing of the Hutus and Tutsis has gathered momentum. By the time we came to June, really, if you asked me, even in retrospect, and I think I've told you this before, would you do the same confronted with the provisional government and Interahamwe and all these killers of that time? I would absolutely do the
Done
same.
the same, yes.
Yes, I would have done the same. Because although it was not the primary motivation to save Tutsis, but at least us capturing state power has saved many Tutsis as a byproduct.
Yeah.
As a byproduct. And I think it saved also many Hutus.
No, and
including you, Sixbert, and many
me,
others.
definitely.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, including me, yes. Yeah.
So I have no apologies for that. I have no to have been and I've said I have no apologies for having belonged to RPF from 1990 up to the time. The only thing that we subsequently say is that RPF and especially General Kagame and his clique have squandered. They have squandered a very big opportunity in the history of Rwanda, because it would have been possible to build something unique that would redress most of the problems that Rwanda has had in the past until then. But instead, Kagame has simply become like every other dictator that has existed in Rwanda before, or has built even more lethal structures of denying the fundamental rights of the people. And we are not even back to square one, because our population, the Hutu population, knows what has happened to them. The Tutsi population knows what has happened to them. We are now in that kind of mutual fear. And any other spark, like the one that Kagame created in 1994, can easily trigger another far-reaching tragedy like the one that we have not yet even recovered from.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA. In this program, we have talked about how President Bill Clinton led the world to abandon Rwanda in 1994. Unfortunately, we are bringing this program to a close, and would you like to have a last comment before we close?
No, I think Sixbert have said all that I wanted to say, but we shall continue this program. Hopefully in the next one, we shall probably next week. In next week, we shall talk about the role of France in what happened in 1994.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed for coming to this program. And next week then. Thank you.